chat and kind of answering questions in over the chat throughout the presentation, and they'll save some of those and pose them to the presenters at the end of the presentation. We should have 15 or 20 minutes for some Q&A. So thank you. Welcome to this Resilient Yards workshop. I am John Bly, the Director of Operations and Special Projects at Metro Blooms, which manages the Blue Thumb program. And you'll be hearing mostly today from Dan Shaw. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. I'm Dan Shaw with the Minnesota Board of Water and Solar Resources. Been working with this lawns and legumes program since 2009.
Great. I'm seeing in the chat, people can see my screen, right? We've got a PowerPoint presentation up.
Yes.
Great. There are a number of steps you want to take to have a successful pollinator habitat project. The first one that often gets overlooked is assessing your yard, assessing what's already there so that you can plan for the right project in the right place. To assess your yard, we find that the easiest way to do that is to get a satellite or overhead image to create a map of your property. You can use Google or Bing Maps, or every county in Minnesota has a GIS mapping service. If you type your county GIS map, you can find your property through that, and that'll have your property lines marked on it. Some of them have really cool, you can see contour lines for elevation, etc. Wherever you get your satellite imagery from, the point is to take that and then add information to it. Some of those images might be a few years old, so if you need to update where your driveway or sidewalks are, you want to do that. And then you want to note how you use the property and what you see happening on the property. So are there, beyond sidewalks, are there paths that you use to get to the garage or around the yard that you know you don't want to fill with 6 foot tall native plants? Are there places for children or dogs or really adults, anyone to play in the yard that you want to leave there? Are there places that are difficult to mow? Are there, you know, do you want to start gardening in like growing food in a specific spot? You'll probably want to do that in one of the sunnier locations. So kind of draw out what exists and what you hope exists. If you're, you know, maybe you want to install a patio. It would be a shame to do that on top of a newly installed pollinator habitat. You know, make a plan. How do you use your yard? What already exists in your yard? Both hardscape, patio, sidewalks, etc., and vegetation that's going to remain. Large trees are good to note because they provide oftentimes dense shade and drier conditions under them with a lot of roots that are difficult to dig through. And so that will affect the plants that you might choose to put under them, might affect your decision to put anything under them. On top of what exists, we like to encourage people to think about how water flows over their property. Native plants have long, extensive root systems that can help capture and filter water into the ground. And if you put a native planting, especially if you dig it out a little bit and make a rain garden with it, if you put a native planting in a place where it can intercept water that's running off of your property, you can help reduce the load on our storm sewers and reduce the amount of pollution that ends up in your local lakes and rivers. The last thing that you want to note on your property is the kind of sun and shady areas, because that will certainly affect the kinds of plants that will thrive in any potential project location. Once you've done that, you can kind of, then you know where might make sense to put a garden. Oftentimes, gardens fit really nicely in the corner of a property. You can round out corners that are difficult to mow right next to. There's a lot of parts of most yards that only get visited by the person mowing the lawn every couple weeks. And if that's all, the only person that's walking over them, that's a great time and place to put something more ecologically beneficial and, subjectively much more beautiful there than just some grass. So take your yard, assess what's there, and start putting together a plan of what you want. So planning is the next step. We have a number of resources on our website that we want to direct you to in order to help you plan if you're at a loss for where to start. You can go to bluethumb.org. Let me pull it up on the screen. There we go. And we have a whole lawns to lagoon section. If you've probably seen some of this, you filled out the form confirming your interest in completing your grant for this fall. So the 2 pages that you would be most interested in right now, I think, are the grantee information page, which talks you through the logistics of the grant, what you need to keep in mind, and then some resources, including last week's webinar, right on this page. The other page that has information that we're covering today in more detail is the How to Plant for Pollinators page. And this has the same steps we're covering, as well as a bunch of resources at the bottom, templates, plant lists, ideas, and other resources that you might find helpful. We're working on organizing this list into kind of subcategories so that you know where all the plant lists and the templates are in one place instead of just an alphabetical list of every PDF we're offering. So you can expect that soon. So that's bluethumb.org/L2L to get to the main Lawns to Lagoons page, and from there you can branch out and check out all the resources. We link to Bowser's website, which also has, bountiful resources. So check those out, and then begin planning the kind of project that you want to see in your yard. We offer 4 projects. We'll reimburse you for 4 different kinds of projects. You can choose one or any combination of these 4. And we'll talk about more in depth. Dan is going to walk you through that.
Okay, thank you, John. So I'll start off talking about native pocket gardens. This is one of our 4 types of projects that we've been promoting for this program. Essentially, these are small native plant gardens. They can be, as small as around 10 by 10 feet in size, but these can provide really high benefits for pollinators. There's research showing that gardens that are cared for can have can be high sources of pollen and nectar for insects. So even though they're small, they can have high benefit, and then you can add onto them over time. A lot of the native plants that we're using for these gardens can be separated over time, and that can be a really good way to expand your gardens. So don't worry about starting small. If that is what is working best for you, it's actually what we recommend for new gardeners, to start relatively small, using containerized plants and then using some wood mulch around those plants. And then pollinator beneficial trees and shrubs is another category. So we do reimburse for trees and shrubs that are beneficial to pollinators. They provide many benefits in our landscape. They can have edible fruit, produce shade, provide autumn color, winter interest, just many benefits. And many of the trees and shrubs bloom early in the spring before the prairie plants are active and blooming. So they can be an important source of pollen and nectar for insects early in the year. So plants like native cherries, black chokeberry, serviceberry, there's some serviceberry in the pictures here. There's really a wide range of different trees and shrubs that can provide benefits to pollinators. Then pollinator lawns is another project type that we've been promoting for this program. These tend to be plantings with fine fescues that sometimes are called low-growing fescues or no-mow fescues that are combined with clovers, or sometimes there's different native plants that can be combined with the fescues. And there's different seed mixes that are currently available from seed companies. And John's going to talk a little bit more later about methods to install pollinator lawns. And our fourth project type is pollinator meadows. Essentially, pollinator meadows are very similar to the pocket plantings, but they're larger in size. They could be pocket plantings that have grown in size over time as you expand your garden. If you're starting with a pollinator meadow, sometimes they're started with a combination of native seed and plants so that you can get plantings established over a larger area. For new gardeners, quite often we promote using containerized plants because it's a little more predictable what it's going to look like, and you can tell when your plants are coming up that you've installed. It's a little harder from seed, so it takes a little more experience or other people collaborating with you when you're using seed. And we wanted to talk about why we're focused on native plants. With this program, we can only reimburse for native plants, and we're focused on them because they provide many benefits for insects and other wildlife in landscapes. Our insect species have adapted with these native plants, and so they get the highest value from the native plants that are installed in landscapes. There's also different host plants and associations, like the monarch butterfly needs milkweed plants as part of its life cycle. So that can be a really important reason to incorporate milkweed and other species into landscapes. And as John mentioned, many of our prairie plants have really deep roots, and that can help build the soil quality, sequester carbon, and then also increase the infiltration of water into the soil. So many benefits of having these diverse plantings of native plants. John was showing you an aerial image, so that can be a good starting point for looking at your landscape and thinking about where your plantings could be located. So one of the next steps is to narrow down a little further of where you think your plantings could go within your landscape and drawing that on a diagram. It doesn't need to be as refined as this diagram. It could be more of a back of the napkin type diagram if needed. So, it's just a process of drawing it on paper, thinking about where you want that planting to go, and then further identifying what project type you're interested in installing. With choosing plant species, there's several considerations. One of them is the amount of sunlight that you'll have in different parts of your yard. We have different planting templates for sun and for shade. What is the soil moisture on your site? If you go to a native plant nursery, quite often they'll ask you, do you have dry soils or wet soils or somewhere in between? In most residential yards, it tends to be somewhere in between. Usually you have soils that have more loam in them, and that leads to more of a medium moisture soil. Also thinking about the characteristics across your site, you might have some areas that are lower and just stay wetter, and that might be an area where you need species that can handle those conditions. Also thinking about the density of your planting that you'll be installing. Quite often we recommend spacing plants about 12 to 18 inches apart for planting. And we do have different planting templates and species lists available on that website that John was showing. We found that those have been really helpful for this program, having some templates and different lists available. There's a list specifically for benefiting the rusty patch bumblebee that we're focused on for this program. So really good information there to check out. Nurseries can be really helpful as well. If you go to them and tell them the characteristics of your site, they can give some good recommendations about plants. And then also thinking about how tall your plants will be is another consideration for different parts of your landscape. And we also promote having plants that bloom in the spring, summer, and fall for plantings to make sure there's resources available for pollinators throughout the season. This is an example of one of the pollinator templates we have for the program. You can see that it's color coded and shows where the different plants would be located within this planting area. This can be really helpful to bring to a native plant nursery to show them an example of what you're thinking for your planting. They may have some other recommendations too, or other ideas. This one is for a rain garden. So this would be for an area where you have created a little depression to collect water, or it could just be for an area that's low in your landscape where you do have more moisture. These plants would do really well. Then with choosing other project materials, with this program, we request that 70% of the costs are related to the plants themselves that you're installing, but other materials can be reimbursed for the program, including wood chips, compost, soil, and edging. It just needs to be a lesser percentage of the cost for the project. Wood chips or leaf mulch can be effective at helping to maintain moisture for new plants and suppress weeds. In most cases, wood mulch is being used around pocket plantings just to help suppress weeds over time. But then other materials can help with the aesthetics of plantings, and it might be ones that you are purchasing through this program, or maybe as things that are already in place within your landscape. Clean lines that are created by edging and walls and sidewalks can really help define plantings and create a sense of order. So those are all helpful for the design process. Another consideration is the layout of plants. In many cases, we recommend grouping plants together. That's a pretty common technique for gardening with perennials, to combine species together. It creates more order. It can help with weeding too, because you'll know where those clumps are of different species, and if something's in there that doesn't belong, it's probably a weed. So it can really help with the maintenance as well. Sometimes plants can be planted in rows in the front, like a border. There's a lot of ways to approach the planting design. And that's a fun part of the process as well, just thinking about how you want those plants arranged. Quite often it is beneficial also to have the taller plants towards the back and then shorter plants near the front. One other step would be to create a plan for your project, the planting plan. You don't have to do something that's real detailed or sophisticated, but it is a way to show how your plants will be laid out within a landscape. You can see in this example that there are many similar plants grouped together, helping to create order within this planting. Again, this can be a pretty rough sketch. You don't have to have it really detailed, or else you could use one of the planting templates that's available as well if you didn't want to go through this step. Finding sources of plant material is an important part of the process. We've been having a lot of discussions about this with our team, trying to figure out, how can we help grant recipients find plants for this program. So what we've been doing is we've been sending out questionnaires to nurseries and creating a new list of native plant nurseries that have confirmed that they have staff that are knowledgeable about native plants, and on request can assemble a special order for you for your project. So that's one list that exists. There's also a longer list of nurseries and companies that supply native seed that's on the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources website. We have links to that through our resources. And there's also a list from the Wild Ones group as well that's useful. And local soil and water conservation districts can be really helpful. In many cases, we direct residents to them for additional assistance because they have knowledgeable staff and they'll know about local native plant nurseries. The next step is planning your installation. Thinking about how you'll prepare your project site, where you'll buy your plants and your materials, and when you'll actually do the planting. In many cases, plants that are purchased are relatively small. They've been grown in nurseries. They need extra care. So as long as they're still in those containers, they'll need watering probably every day because that's what they would have been getting at the nursery. And those little plants are used to that. So they need extra care as you're preparing for your project. You can install projects in phases, but we recommend not having exposed soil for extended periods of time because you can get weeds establishing, and then you need to start over with your site preparation process again. So trying to cover that up with wood mulch or cardboard or something just to suppress those weeds in the meantime is really helpful. Like if you're waiting for some plants to come in, you might want to prepare that area first. And then if it takes time for the plants, then you'll be suppressing the weeds. Then we'll move on to the installation process, talking about purchasing your plants and materials, preparing for your project site, and then installing your project. With the process of purchasing your plants and materials, it's good to have a plan in place, keep your plants healthy until they're planted in the ground. As we mentioned, they might need daily watering. Some native plant nurseries deliver or else they'll mail plants to you. So that's one thing to check in about with the nurseries that you'll be contacting. So if you contact one of the nurseries that's on the new list, you can check in with them if they can deliver. Some of them also have plant kits for doing pocket plantings. That can be really helpful if you're a new gardener. That's one way to keep the process as simple as possible. We wanted to go into some detail about preparing your project site. You'll be working on these projects in the fall. So you'll have less time potentially than maybe some of our other groups of grant recipients to do your site preparation. One thing you'll want to be thinking about is removing the grass, removing the sod. There's different ways of doing that. The picture on the left, there's a sod kicker being used. Those can quite often be rented from hardware stores. There's also sod cutters that are gas-powered versions of this that can remove grass pretty efficiently with a cutting bar. So that's another type of equipment that can be rented from hardware stores. Sometimes just shovels can be used to remove sod like this if it's a relatively small area. It's good to have a crew together if you can to kind of do this work and help out. So those are the quickest ways to remove sod. Once you remove the sod, it's helpful to loosen that upper soil surface. Quite often our lawn areas are pretty compacted because there's been a lot of foot traffic on those areas and they can get compacted over time. And then we also recommend putting down the wood mulch actually before you plant. And the reason for that is that if you're walking around on bare soil, it starts getting compacted again. And if you have the wood chips down, it prevents that compaction. So in a lot of cases, we'll put the wood chips down, then we'll lay out our plants, and then carefully kind of pull the mulch away, dig holes, and then put the mulch back in place. There are some other options for preparing your site. One is using cardboard. There's different methods that are used. Sometimes there's cardboard and compost and then wood chips on top. That would be the approach they're doing in this image. In other cases, you can just do cardboard and then wood chips on top of that, and then cut holes. You want to get the sod out from underneath where you're digging the hole to put in your new plant to make sure that the sod isn't going to compete with your plant. But that can be an effective method. Also, if you have a lawn area that really doesn't have very competitive grass, you can mow it really low and sometimes just put on a heavy layer of wood chips. If you have a good supply of wood chips, that can be enough. You might need to add more wood chips over time if some of the grass starts poking up. But those are some of the more efficient or fastest ways of doing your preparation for the lawn areas. Solarization is one other method where you can use plastic to remove the grass. That really relies on long sunny days, which we're getting less of those now. So it's not going to be a good time to use solarization. It's a good practice for the summer. And the Xerxes Society has a really good guide on organic site preparation techniques that provides lots of detail on some of these methods. I noticed there was a question in the chat about fall planting, and we wanted to go into detail on this because you are, I think, our first group that is going into fall with planting. And it's really not that different than planting other times of the year. It can be really effective to plant in the fall, and actually better for some types of plants to plant in the fall. Trees and shrubs really do well in fall planting. And then it's pretty common that most of our pollinator seed mixes are installed in the fall. That's our best time to plant because many seeds of our flowers need to go through a winter to break the dormancy of their seed coat. They need freezing and thawing conditions to break that dormancy. It creates conditions for them to be able to grow quickly in the spring. If you are using containerized plants going into fall, there's a couple considerations. One is that your plants might be going dormant, and that's okay. That may be true with trees and shrubs also. But if your grasses and flowers don't look very good, that's okay. As long as they came from a nursery that's been taking care of them, they should be fine. They're just going dormant for the year. You can install them the same as you would a plant that is green and flowering. And then it's really helpful to have wood chips or leaf mulch around those plants going into fall. One risk for plants going into winter is that if the soils are really dry and they continue being dry into winter, it can dry out the root mass and those plants may not make it through the winter. So it's really helpful to water them right when you install them, even if they are dormant, and then do some periodic watering if you're not getting good rainfall going into winter. And that'll help get them ready for winter and get them off to a good start. With installing a native pocket planting, we discussed putting the wood chips down first, and that's what they're doing in this picture that we're seeing in the middle. They have the plants installed, they're measuring out the distance, which again would be about 1 foot to 1.5 feet of spacing for most plants. And the pictures on the left, those are plug containers. So that's pretty common to get plants that are in these little plug containers from native plant nurseries. Don't worry too much about their size. As long as they have a good root mass there, they're going to be healthy and be able to establish. So it's pretty common that we do install plants that size. Those look like 4-inch containers that are being installed in the picture in the middle. So there are different container sizes. There's different prices for different containers for different sizes. So different options for the size of the plants. There's several considerations when planting trees, and sometimes trees don't get planted correctly. One consideration is making sure the hole is big enough. We recommend having the hole about twice as wide as the root mass or the root ball of that tree. And the reason for that is that we don't want the roots to have to try to extend into compacted soil on the edges. Sometimes we scarify the edges on the outer edges of the hole just to loosen that up, and then we backfill the soil. The planting depth is really important. You don't want the tree planted too deep. It's helpful to feel around at the base of the tree for where the roots are located, because you want those roots that are near the surface within about an inch of the surface after you're done planting. So kind of feel around the top there of that root mass, figure out where those roots are. Sometimes in nurseries, they do put too much soil into these pots. And so those roots can be a little bit too low right away. Circling roots is another concern. If you pull your tree out of your container and the roots are circling around, that's not good for the tree. They'll keep growing in a circle. And so you want to redirect those if you can, or if you can't redirect them, to prune those off as long as the tree has enough other roots. That's okay for the tree. And then when you're backfilling the hole, it's best to backfill, put some water in. You might want to tamp it a little bit. The main thing is to make sure there's not any air spaces in there, but you also don't want to overly compact that soil. You don't want to stomp on it with your foot. You don't want it compacted. And sometimes when soil is moist, it does compact easily. So you just want it firm. That's the main thing. Try to get firm soil in there after that tree is planted. And John is going to cover pollinator lawn installation.
Yes. There's kind of two ways to install a pollinator lawn. One is with dormant seeding, and one is with kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, live seeding. So if you have already begun installing a pollinator lawn in late August, really early September, you could consider it live seeding. Otherwise, we would suggest you wait to dormant seed, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. For this slide, whether live or dormant, assuming you have an area of lawn that is free of highly invasive weeds that might take over a newly establishing bee lawn, you can simply just mow your lawn as short as possible for a first step. This stresses out your existing lawn and exposes more of the area to sunlight and exposes more of the soil so that you'll get better seed to soil contact when you sow your seeds. After you mow, you want to rake the clippings to expose as much soil as possible. Again, to improve the seed to soil contact of the bee lawn you're establishing. Then you'll want to spread seed. We have the seeding rates are on our website and a variety of our resources. I think if you're putting in the regular bee lawn, fescue, white clover, self-heal, and creeping thyme, it's about 4 pounds of fescue seed per 1,000 feet. And then the flower seeds are measured in ounces, somewhere between 2 and 8 ounces per 1,000 feet. So we're not talking about much seed. To spread that over a large area, sometimes it helps to add some compost or some sand and mix it all together so that you have a larger amount of material you're spreading. It's kind of more forgiving when you put it in your, seed whirligig cart to spread it around, or even just hand sowing it. So you'll spread your seed at the recommended seeding rate. And then if you've already done this, if you're doing a live seeding in the fall, you'll want to keep it moist until it sprouts. And then for the next week or so, keep watering it. You don't need to fertilize it anymore, and help it put down roots before the winter comes, so that it'll come back in the spring. If you've already started doing this, good luck. Fall is an okay time to install a live seeding of a bee lawn. The best thing to do in the fall, though, is to wait another month or so until ground temperatures are below 55 degrees, but above freezing. You want it cold enough so that the seeds won't germinate in November and then be killed off by the frost. But you want the ground to not be frozen yet, so that you can imagine ground that isn't yet frozen has more give to it, and when you throw the seeds on it, they'll sit on it better and have better seed to soil contact. If you sow on frozen ground, it's not going to have as good of seed to soil contact, and more seed will sit on the very top and probably be eaten by mice and all sorts of other critters over the winter. So you're going to wait late October, early November, sow the seed like in step 3, and then don't water, because you've probably turned off your outdoor taps for the year anyway, and you don't want these seeds to sprout until spring. Once they start germinating in the spring, you'll want to make sure that they receive water. If not from rain or melted snow, be sure to water them for the first few weeks or up to a month in the spring, so that they get a head start. The reason that dormant seeding is the most recommended to install a pollinator lawn is that those seeds are there, they're under the snow, and they're ready to germinate as soon as conditions allow in the springtime. If you're live seeding a garden now, or live seeding a pollinator lawn now, those seeds will be competing against plants, grass, and potentially weeds that have been in your lawn, growing, soaking up sun, storing energy in their roots all summer, and they'll have a harder time competing against those established plants that have had 4 to 6 months head start of growing on them. So dormant seeding is what we would recommend. Once you get that going next spring, we would encourage you to never again mow below 3 inches. These low-growing flowers in the lawn, like clover and thyme, are low-growing, but they do need some clearance. And if you're mowing too low, you won't allow the plants there to provide the pollinator habitat that we want to see. The other benefit of keeping a taller lawn is that the taller leaves of grass shade the ground, keep it cooler, which in turn prevents other weeds from weed seeds from getting good seed to soil contact and germinating from heat of the sun. Keep it cooler so that there's less evaporation and more water gets into the ground. And what a lot of people are surprised to learn is that the roots of grass generally grow as far down as the leaves of grass are allowed to grow above ground. And so a longer grass should have deeper roots, which means healthier, store more carbon, infiltrate more water, and you'll have to water less. So herbicides, most of those will kill the plants that the low-growing flowers that you've put in your yard. So you'll have to stop doing that and start pulling the weeds that you don't want in your lawn by hand. I'll pass it back to Dan to talk about installing pollinator meadow.
Okay, thanks, John. We talked a little bit already about pollinator meadows that sometimes are planted by containerized plants, and you're just kind of expanding the garden over time by separating plants or purchasing new plants to add into a meadow. They can also be installed with native seeds. We've discussed that it's best to plant native seeds as fall dormant seeding, so at like similar to the pollinator lawn, you'd be waiting until mid-October going into November to do seeding of native plant seeds. So if you're planning to do a combination of seed and plants, you could install the plants sooner and install the seed later. One note with native plant seed is that the flowers need to be near the surface. You don't want to bury flower seeds very deep at all. If they get buried, they typically won't germinate, and you can lightly rake them into the surface, but you don't want to rake them very much. Plants that are growing from seed do take time to establish, particularly many of our native prairie plants. They'll spend a year or two putting down deep roots, and then they'll start putting on more height. So it can take a while with some of those little prairie plants to get going and growing. It'll depend sometimes on your soil that you have at your site, related to how fast they grow and the amount of moisture that they're getting also. I think those are the main things with pollinator with meadows. It's just may take time if you're going from seed, but you can just keep expanding your gardens over time with containerized plants also. And then we'll finish off with this webinar talking about maintenance and focusing on weeding and watering. We've been in drought conditions for a couple years now in most parts of Minnesota. Last year was a significant drought over a good part of the state, and this year I think we're around 7 inches behind for the summer in the Twin Cities metro area. So things are very dry, and it can create challenges for establishing plants. We just want to make sure that as you're installing new plants that you're watering them in once you get them installed. If they're coming from a nursery, they have been taken a very good care of in that nursery. They've been watered probably every day. So you may need to water them every day for a while, just until they seem like they're taking hold and getting established. And then making sure that you're watering about 1 inch a week. And that can be a combination of rainfall and watering. So if you got good rainfall, you're not going to need to do additional watering, but just keeping track of that. Sometimes it's helpful to put a tuna can or something out in your garden and using that to keep track of how much rainfall you've received for that area. Pulling weeds is another important step for the few years of establishment. Trying to get weeds early before they get too big. That's particularly true with woody plants. I think that's a Siberian elm there in that picture. They can grow fast, and once they get some roots down, they can get really hard to pull out. So it's best to get them when they're small. It's really helpful to weed after a rainfall or after you water. The ground really loosens up, so it's a lot easier to pull weeds out. Keep your plantings clear of debris, and then replacing mulch and plants as needed. As your plantings mature over time, as they get 3-4 years old, you may not need much wood chip anymore because the plants will be suppressing weeds. They're big. They're producing their own thatch layer on the ground. So you may need less wood chips and maybe just on the front edges for aesthetics over time. When we talk about weeding, sometimes we recommend specific dates just to help people remember times to go out and do weeding. So around Memorial Day, July 4th, and Labor Day are good dates to keep in mind for weeding. We recommend weeding plantings at least 3 times a year. It's good just to go out there periodically and just spot things and pull them out, as you have time. But trying to get out there at least 3 times a year is helpful. Just trying to pull those weeds before they spread, and particularly before they seed and can create more plants. Inspect for any erosion problems or other issues in your plantings. And then in the spring, you can cut back your plants, but we recommend waiting until the dandelions start blooming. And the reason for that is that many native bees nest in the stems of native plants. And if those plants are disturbed too early in the year, then it can harm those insects. So it's beneficial to wait to cut back your native plants until a little later in the spring. Sometimes we do cut back some in the fall, but we cut them back up higher because some of the plants that we're installing, it's helpful to have some exposed openings in those plants for those insects to go in and do some nesting. So that brings us to the end. I think I'll turn it back over to you here, John.
Thanks, Dan. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. This presentation, these slides, and the recording will be available on the Blue Thumb website soon. I just want to remind you, if you're feeling overwhelmed by all this information, it is okay to start small. Even small gardens can make a big difference. So thank you for tuning in, and we have time for questions now.
So I have been answering questions in the background. This is Becky Rice. I'm the director of the Blue Thumb program, and been trying to answer your questions as best I can in the chat. I have a couple questions though that for you, Dan, that I don't know the answer to. We have one question about cedar mulch, and does it repel insects? Is it okay for to use in a native planting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if we have clear information on that. Cedar potentially could repel some insects that might be living in the ground because it does have some chemicals in cedar that makes it last a long time. And that's a really good question. I'm not aware of any research or information on that. It's not going to deter any pollinators from coming to the garden. I'm pretty certain that that's not a concern. It might be worms or decomposers that would be in the wood mulch that it might inhibit. But as far as pollinators, I wouldn't worry about it deterring pollinators from using that garden. We just don't have information on that, but I don't see that as an issue.
Thanks, Dan. Then we had another question about someone with small children in their yard, and are there any poisonous natives that they should avoid that you know of?
Yeah, that's another really good question. Most poisonous plants that are in our landscapes, like native plants, we don't plant those, or they're not available from nurseries. There's plants that definitely are not good to ingest. Milkweed would be an example where it's not going to be something that's healthy for people, but actually milkweed is partially edible for people. But most plants, I wouldn't consider them edible. But I can't think of any native plants that we commonly use in these types of projects that would pose a risk to children. Those plants just aren't available in the nursery trade.
Okay, then we had another question about several questions about prepping the site. I'm gonna include all of them. One of them is the use of landscape fabric, tilling, your recommendations on tilling, and planting on slopes.
Yeah, I'll start with landscape fabric. Usually we don't recommend landscape fabric because even if you do put wood chips on it, it ends up showing up again at some point. And we do want these native plants to spread across areas, and we want them to be reseeding themselves over time. And in order for that to happen, we do want some bare ground down there. So we have been discouraging landscape fabric as part of these plantings. It just deters more of a natural process developing at these sites. It would also deter ground nesting bees like the rusty patch bumblebee that we're trying to benefit through this program does nest in the ground. So you need some areas of bare soil where it can get down into the ground and do its nesting. The tilling of the soil, that could be an option for some sites, particularly if you don't have very aggressive grass to start with. The one concern with tilling, like just tilling it once, is that you're resuspending the rhizomes in the plants and the weed seeds. And so you're not fully suppressing them and they can regrow. So if somebody is tilling, quite often we'll recommend that they till like 3 times in a row, a couple of weeks apart, to really help remove that vegetation that's there. So it can work in some situations if you don't have much competitive grass there to start with. But if you do, then it's not going to work quite as well. Planting on slopes, sometimes that's a little trickier for trying to prep the soil because there is a risk of erosion. If you use cardboard and wood chips, the wood chips just slide down the hill, so that doesn't work very well. So it's probably best to use a sod cutter, sod kicker, install your plants right away, get wood chips on that slope. So trying to do the process more quickly to get everything done to prevent any erosion from happening on that slope.
And I'll just throw in, we really recommend double shredded hardwood mulch in areas that might see water flowing over it, or in the case of on a hill, the hardwood means it's a denser wood, it's heavier, it's less likely to be blown or washed away. And the double shredded means that it's got more fibrous edges that'll lock together and hold in place better than, you know, if you just get wood pine chips, those might, you know, kind of wash onto the sidewalk or something easier.
Thanks, John. We had another question about how to avoid, how do we install a project to avoid disrupting pollinators that might be nesting there?
Yeah, that is a really good question. If you do have an area where there may be pollinators nesting, it probably is more intact. There probably are some native plants there. It probably isn't just typical lawn. Standard lawn, we don't know of any cases where native pollinators are nesting in that type of ground surface. They really need bare ground typically, like little pockets of open bare ground area to nest in. So they don't like solid sod. So usually if you do have pollinators nesting in a certain area, it already has some native condition or characteristics there. You could lightly seed in some species into an area like that, may be a good way to go. If you are going to use containerized plants, probably using plug containers would be the best, and just digging small holes and installing those plants. Maybe you don't plant them quite as dense in that area, so you don't disturb that area quite as much by digging. I think that would be the main thing, trying to find ways to decrease the soil disturbance in that type of area.
Then we've had several questions about related to, you spoke to the creeping Charlie in a pollinator lawn and how to plant a pollinator lawn where there exists a creeping Charlie. Do you have recommendations?
Yeah, creeping Charlie is a tough one. It likes to persist, and once it's in an area, it keeps spreading. So that's the challenge with creeping Charlie. I think you can definitely find ways to suppress it, and it may be best just to start from scratch, like using a sod cutter, sod kicker, finding some way to remove the existing sod, and then starting with a pollinator lawn mix would be the most effective way to start an area that would be free of creeping Charlie. If you're trying to interseed into an existing lawn that has creeping Charlie, I guess the hope would be by adding more diversity, you're going to be providing some competition for that creeping Charlie. I don't know that you're ever going to be able to fully remove that creeping Charlie from that, without, chemical methods or other more intensive methods. So it's maybe something that you just need to live with. Creeping Charlie does provide some pollinator benefit. It's not a really beneficial plant for pollinators, but unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer for you on that one.
Thanks, Dan. No one has an answer to creeping Charlie, I don't. Another question for you, Dan, about weeds in the early stages when the plants or seeds are just emerging. How do you tell the difference between the weeds and the flowers in their early growth stage?
There are some pretty good websites that do have information on that, and there's some small guides available on weed seed identification. Might be best if you can find an expert out there that can come and look at your planting and give you some pointers on it. It can be really tricky to tell weeds apart from native plant seedlings when they're really tiny. It does take more knowledge from people that have been doing that kind of thing for quite a while. So, maybe something where you need to find a friend, somebody that, has some experience with that. But there are some pretty good guides out there too. I think, those tend to be focused on the native plant seedlings and what they look like. So if you can get a good sense of what those look like, maybe you can narrow it down to which ones are the weeds that are coming in there. I think too, the weeds will come in usually much more dense than the native plants will. So if you're seeing a lot of something, it may be a weed versus a native plant. So yeah, that's a tricky one too. And it's, that takes a learning process to learn those native plant seedlings.
I have another question about fall yard care for pollinators and raking the leaves. Is it better to leave them over the winter or rake them before winter?
Well, particularly in any of the areas where you have pollinator habitat, it's best to leave leaves in place. Any areas that you have actual turf, lawn, those areas can be raked. And what I do in my own landscape is I just move the leaves from the lawn into the native planting areas, and they just they provide additional insulation for those plants that are there. They help hold moisture in place. So I try to use the leaves that are in the landscape, just moving them from one place to another.
And to expand on a shady planting, can you get away with a pocket planting under some maple trees?
Yeah, definitely. There's native plants that are pretty well adapted for growing under maple trees. Sometimes we call those spring ephemerals. They're plants that naturally grow in like maple basswood forests. There's ferns that can handle those conditions pretty well also. But plants like Jacob's ladder and wild geranium, there's a variety of native flowers that can grow in those conditions and thrive pretty well.
What about deadheading native flowers?
We don't do that very often, it seems like, but deadheading is a technique to stimulate more flower production on a plant. So once a flower is done blooming on a plant, if you deadhead it, you pull those flowers off, it can stimulate it to rebloom again. So I do see that there could be some benefits for pollinators by deadheading. It doesn't seem like something we do too often in native plants, partly because in a lot of native plantings, we just have a succession of flowers coming in as different plants are blooming, and those insects are using those flowers as they come in. But I do see some potential benefit for doing that.
I know we are at our time. I have one more question, and And then it's in regard to having plants for all seasons. And can you talk a little bit more about what you're looking for in terms of number of flowers for each season?
I mean, in a lot of cases, we recommend like 3 blooming plants per season as a minimum. So trying to find plants that'll bloom in the spring, the summer, and the fall. The spring is quite often the most difficult to think about what those plants are going to be for spring. We have lots that bloom in the summer. We have lots of asters and goldenrods that bloom in the fall, but there are many plants that do bloom in the spring. There, different violets, prairie smoke, golden Alexanders is a really good plant that's beneficial for pollinators. Pasque flower. There's quite a few plants that do bloom in the spring. There's actually more plants that grow in woodlands than in prairies that bloom in the spring, those spring ephemerals that bloom in the spring. So those can be really helpful for bumblebees in particular, because the queens are out looking for flower sources in April quite often. They're out there really early looking for flower sources. So that's where those plants can be really important.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We also have a lot of questions regarding the coach assignments. Coach assignments have not, well, they have been made, but they haven't been shared with any of the new gardeners who requested a coach. They will be shared within the next week. You'll be getting coach assignments. Some of the recipients who requested a coach will be, we have office hours available to some. We didn't have enough coaches for everyone, so we do have some office hours available. So for a virtual call with one of our landscape designers or with John and I, and you'll be hearing about those. Upcoming. Any additional questions? If you do not request a coach, for any additional questions that you might have that isn't answered during the webinar, there's a lot of information on the grantee information page, and I know we've referred to that a couple times. Please check out that, become familiar with that page, because there's a lot of resources on there, and especially there's a list of eligible reimbursable expenses, and we don't want you to trip you up there and for you to come time to get reimbursed and to find out some of the things that you purchased are not eligible for reimbursement. We hate to have to say, no, I'm sorry, this isn't eligible. So please become familiar with that sheet. It's at the grantee information page, along with a lot of other resources. And if the information that is not available there, there's also, we have an L2L helpline it's L2L help at metroblooms.org. Is that right? What is it, John?
L2L help at bluethumb.org.
All right, I'm going to put it in the chat. But that also, information about that is also available on the grantee information page.
And I just want to stress the important role that you're all playing for pollinators. We really appreciate your efforts and your work on this program. Keep things as simple as you need to for getting started and getting going with your projects. Use planting templates, order planting kits, whatever it takes to kind of keep it simple if you need to keep it simple. And ask questions as you go if you need additional assistance.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. And
Thank you.
Hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you and good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.